Thank you, Raggy. And today I very much welcome Dr. Hugo Anderson-Whymark. I've known Hugo for many years, since we worked together at Stonehenge, which is a long time ago now, Hugo, actually. Hugo did his PhD with Richard Bradley at Reading and has worked on a number of projects. He worked on the Stepping Stone project, and more recently he worked with Mark Edmonds on that a really excellent stone project prehistoric stone in Orkney, of which I'm particularly grateful for the work he did for me. But now he's senior curator of prehistory at the National Museum. And today he's going to be talking to us about Calvestone balls, which is really interesting and topical because Andy Jones has been doing research on Calvestone balls and has been publishing widely on these. So it'd be really interesting to hear what you've got to say, Hugo. So with that, I'll hand you over to Hugo and his seminar.
Thank you, Colin. Yeah, am I echoing anymore, or is it just me now? It's okay. Right. Well, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you today. And I'm talking to you about one of my favourite artefacts at the National Museum, Calvestone balls. And the National Museum has the world's largest collection of Calvestone balls. These are pretty much only found in Scotland. And we have a collection of some 140 original examples and casts of another 60. So a really wonderful collection of these objects. And I really hope I can give you a flavour of some of the research that's gone on to these over the last 150 years, as well as sort of share with you some of the work we've been doing at the museum to make our collections more accessible to everyone around the world. So for those of you who've not come across Calvestone balls before, here are a few examples and a brief sort of overview of them. They are basically tennis ball sort of sized stones. They're all of a very similar size. There are a few larger ones, there's a few smaller ones, but they mostly fit neatly in the palm of your hand, basically. That's 65, 75 mil across. One of the characteristics of these is that they're generally covered in different sized knobs across their surface, sort of discs or knobs, depending what you want to call them. And you can see from this image, some have very few knobs on their surface, and they have between 3 and over 160, I think over 180 knobs in some cases across the surface of these objects. And in some cases, the designs are actually marked out by incised patterns instead. So there's a massive variety in the decoration of these objects. You can see here the geology is very varied too, often representing the parts of Scotland in which they are made. And there are around 520 known. There aren't that many in museums. This is a total sort of derived from all the different catalogues that have been made over the years, as well as a number that we know from archaeological literature that we no longer know the whereabouts of. And I'm going to sort of touch on a couple of those cases from Orkney as well, because they're probably still out there somewhere on someone's mantelpiece or similar location. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this class of object is that they have a very localized distribution. And you can see from this rather old map that the vast majority of them are in Aberdeenshire and the sort of immediately surrounding area. And that distribution very much rapidly drops off in every other direction. There are only 2 known from England and a couple from Ireland as well. And the one outlier is one from Norway. That was discovered in the 1940s in a relatively modern clearance cairn. No one knows how it's got there. It could have got there quite recently, but at the time when it was found, it was quite a popular account that it was brought there by the Vikings. We don't know how it got there. What seems quite unlikely is it actually went there in prehistory, because we don't see that sort of contact across the North Sea during that period. Now, in terms of the date of Calvestone balls, some of the best dated examples that we have are from Orkney. In general, we have a real problem with Calvestone balls in that the vast majority have been found as surface finds picked up from fields by agricultural workers. They don't actually have any close provenance that allows us to date these objects. So there's only a handful that have ever been found in archaeological excavations, and the vast majority of these are dated from the late Neolithic. There's some suggestion that some are early Bronze Age in date, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, the best dated example comes from the Nest of Broadca. It's this Calvestone ball at the bottom here, and this was found in 2013 at the Nest of Broadca. Very exciting discovery. I was lucky enough to be there on site at the time, as was Professor Mark Edmonds, shown here when at the point of the discovery. And he's a sort of recognised expert on Cardstone balls, so obviously a great person to have around when you just discovered one. Now, this is a very exciting discovery because the place it was found was a very secure archaeological context. I've put a star on this map. If you don't know the Nest of Broadca, these Neolithic buildings here, there's lots of relatively large buildings, but by far the biggest building here, I think you can see the outline of my mouse, is this one, Structure 10. And this building was monumental, one of the biggest stone-built buildings ever built in the Neolithic. And it was a bit structurally unsound. And in a later phase of building, they built buttresses in the internal space. Now, this ball was placed as an offering beneath one of those buttresses just before they rebuilt it. And in the opposite corner, there was a lovely panel of rock art and some human bones as well placed before they built the other buttress. Now, this deposit has been very accurately dated to being deposited just before 2900 BC. So that's the most accurate date we have for a Calvestone ball. But there are also a number of examples from Skara Brae. Now, because most of these were found in the 19th century, we're not dating the individual context in which they were found, but we know that the phase of activity that they were found in, the phase associated with these very well-preserved structures, which you can go and visit today, is dated to the late Neolithic, somewhere between 2800 2400 BC. So again, sitting well within the sort of late Neolithic. Now, you might wonder why the dating of Skara Brae didn't suggest that these balls were. There's been a big question about the date of these balls that goes right back into the Victorian period, and those from Skara Brae obviously were found, many of them very early in the 1860s. But at the time, Skara Brae was very much an undated settlement. It was actually assumed to be Pictish as late as the 1930s. So the evidence of the Calvestone balls being found in those contexts was often misleading in terms of the dating of Calvestone balls. And it was only much later that we see this refined. Now, it's actually quite useful to look back over the range of different dates which have been proposed for these objects over the years, because there's really two principal schools of thought here. One which says they're prehistoric, and the other that says they're sort of early historic, so either sort of Iron Age or Pictish in date. Now, the argument for them being prehistoric was primarily put forward by Sir John Evans, pictured here, and he obviously was a very he did an awful lot of studies of stone tools across Britain during the 1870s onwards, and the associations he identified were drawing on the patterns of the Towie ball here at the top, rotating. This is one of the finest Calvestone balls ever discovered. It's found in 1860 while digging in Aberdeenshire, digging a drainage ditch. And to John Evans, the markings on this stone had parallels with the tombs, the carvings on the tombs in Ireland, such as Newgrange, the entrance stone shown here. Now, at the time, that monument was assumed to be Bronze Age, which is why he suggested it's Bronze Age. We know now that this style of monument, these passage graves, are Neolithic. Now, as the Victorian period progressed, new evidence came to light, as you might expect. And in the second edition of Ancient Stone Implements, John Evans flagged up the Folkton Drums here, which were discovered in Yorkshire, which have sort of concentric circle patterns decorated on the top, and obviously other examples of decoration around the side, as another parallel. And again, they were known to be prehistoric in the Victorian period. So Bronze Age, they assumed. We now know them to be late Neolithic. So there's a very strong argument there for that date. But the dating that was being proposed for them being Iron Age to early Christian really comes from Joseph Anderson. And a lot of the Scottish antiquarians thought these were later in date. Now, Joseph Anderson drew on the evidence that came from this little bronze ball. Now, this ball is only it's about half the size of a Calvestone ball. It's only about 1.25 inches across. And because it's made of metal, you can see the decoration on the surface as well. It's very characteristic of that Celtic style art. Evans, again, drew parallels from the spirals on the Elgin ball here, the Towie ball here, and suggested that these were therefore much later in date. Now, at the time, many people pointed out that the spirals on these balls didn't bear a very close resemblance to Celtic art at all. So this was very much questioned at the time, but Joseph Anderson was a very influential figure in Scottish archaeology. His word was not dismissed lightly, and it basically came to be that Calvestone balls were presented as Iron Age to early Christian for a very long time in the National Museum. And in fact, it wasn't really questioned until well into the 1930s that this wasn't the date for these objects. Now, I mentioned there as well, Gordon Child thought these were Pictish, and again, that's because he believed that the settlement of Skara Brae was much later in date, right into the 1930s, when it was eventually redated in the mid-1930s. Stuart Pigott looked at the pottery, said it's Neolithic, late Neolithic, but actually for Calvestone balls, the first time we see a Calvestone ball referred to as late Neolithic in print is actually in Pigott and Daniel's work on rock art in 1951. So it was more than 100 years where the date of these balls was really open to debate and oscillated backwards and forwards depending on your opinions. So this has had quite an effect on what we see in the literature and the associations and suggestions about the use of these objects. Now, coming back to the sort of early Bronze Age examples, it came back to Dorothy Marshall, her work in the between the 60s and 1980s, and she reviewed all of the associations of known Calvestone balls, and she pointed out that a number of those which were found in the 19th century had provenances that sounded like they could be Bronze Age. One found in a tumulus, one found with a boar's tusk near a half-demolished tumulus. Again, that could be late Neolithic, could be early Bronze Age, but certainly sounds prehistoric. And the third one was found about a foot from a short kist, surrounded by a small ring cairn. Now, this is very much a description of a Bronze Age style of burial. In the 19th century, they knew short kists were Bronze Age, and it was this Calvestone ball shown here that was found in that kist. Now, the person writing about this was convinced that that association was incorrect because they thought they were later in date. And so they pointed out that it had been found outside the kist. But we know today that actually in the Bronze Age, not all objects were buried in the kist. Many were placed outside the kist as well. So, you know, we have an association here which actually sounds quite convincing as something that could have been buried in the Bronze Age. Now, another really interesting example is in the National Museum here. this carved stone ball from Archeeling in Stripes in Moray was one of two found in a grave in 1897. And this was published as a little note at the time, but it wasn't really generally accepted as a genuine association. And in the museum, we've got some sort of quite interesting correspondence about this ball. There's actually a letter from the finder, who was the farmer and the local antiquarian. He excavated a lot of archaeology on his land, and he described to Frederick Coles, an assistant keeper at the museum, who I'll mention again in a moment, that he took the balls out of the grave. They were just where the hands would be. Again, he was talking about a short kist. Now, this was not accepted by anyone at the museum at all. And when eventually this object was donated, the provenance is written in the accession book. And there was this remarkable note in pencil afterwards, which says that that provenance has not generally been accepted as correct. It was dismissing what was actually quite a convincing association for these objects. So I think we benefit a lot by revisiting those descriptions with an open mind. And I think this is possibly a very good example of a carved stone ball. Now, what we don't know is whether these are like curated items, Neolithic objects that have been circulating for a long period of time before being buried. But I think it's interesting, if you look at this carved stone ball, you can see from this view, it's actually more cuboid than most examples we have. So it's a really quite odd shape. It's sort of got rounded corners, but it's effectively, it's not a sphere in that form. And also, if you see the way that the light is reflecting on the surface, this ball is really actually quite highly polished. And that's really unusual for carved stone balls in the Neolithic. Most of them are ground smooth. So although they're finely finished on their surface, they're not brightly polished. So this stands out as being something slightly different. And again, I wonder if that could be because it is an early Bronze Age example of this artifact rather than a Neolithic. Now, there were many other sort of red herrings in the 19th century. If you believed in a later date for these objects, people were referring to these provenances. But there are some actually quite interesting associations with early medieval sites, such as Dunad, where one was found within the walls, and also a number of examples that have been recovered from religious locations, be it in the grounds of churches or within the nunnery at Iona, amongst another collection of antiquities. One was most recently recovered by Martin Carver excavating in the 17th century rubble in Tarbot's old parish church. And we got a really interesting thing there. These are perhaps objects that have been rediscovered and perhaps reburied at a much later date. I do wonder here if these are objects which have basically been buried in a religious context or deliberately to perhaps somehow get rid of them. I wonder if there was folklore associated with these objects. We don't have any documented, but you know, obviously for arrowheads, there's lots of folklore about elf shot, and for axe heads, folklore about thunderstones that was very broadly spread across Britain in those beliefs. And I just wonder if in Aberdeenshire there was some specific knowledge of these objects that, you know, folklore that hasn't been written down. Be a really interesting thing to know. So I've put obviously up an image of a carved stone ball here showing the six faces. The cross was just to remind me of those religious associations. But you can see within the form of some of these objects, there is in essence a cross as well. So I do wonder if there is a genuine interest taken in these objects when they were discovered in early medieval times, or you know, even much later dates as well. So I mentioned that there's been a very long history of research into carved stone balls. I'd like to really start with Daniel Wilson back in 1851. His wonderful dense volumes are the Archaeology and Prehistoric Annals of Scotland, because this really sort of kick-started the interest in carved stone balls. There had been many in collections much earlier than this. There were 3 in the Hunterians, found in collections. But in this volume, Daniel Wilson illustrated the one example that was in the National Museum at that time. Now, this Cardstone ball, we don't know exactly when it came into the museum, but certainly it was in the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland Museum by about 1800. And he just published a little note about these objects, but the illustration, and this stimulated an interest amongst archaeologists across Britain. And there became a real collecting phase over the next 100 years, where we see vast competition between museums and collectors to gather these examples, with some very big collections formed during this period. And obviously a great deal of publications coming out as well. So just less than 25 years later, we see a very comprehensive account come out on Calvestone balls by John Alexander Smith. It's published in the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland's Proceedings. You can access this freely online. It's a really interesting account, actually. He sort of creates a very basic typology of them. He really richly illustrates the volume with wonderful woodcuts. And we get the first sight of some objects which we no longer know the whereabouts of. This one in the middle here is from, it was in the Royal Collection in the 19th century. It has its current whereabouts are entirely unknown. So these ones have come and gone from the record as they were. Other ones, the Elgin ball here is in the National Museum. This example you'll see a nice 3D model of in a minute, and that one's in Perth Museum. So we sort of see many of these have gone different routes over the years, and we sort of track them down to different places. Now, I mentioned Frederick Coles. He was an assistant keeper at the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, predecessor of National Museums Scotland. And he undertook a very comprehensive piece of recording of Calvestone balls from about 1908 to 1911. And he wrote to every collector that had Calvestone balls. He managed to document about 137 examples. And he produced wonderful illustrations. He was an artist by training, so we've got wonderful sketches of decorations, different bits of the balls, lots of notes, and his original correspondence survives as well. And he left a half-finished manuscript about Calvestone balls where he tried to create a typology of them. Now, the archive survives. It was unfortunately, his work never came to completion because he left the museum in disgrace in 1912 for pawning some of the coin collection. So he was dismissed, and that kind of put an end to this project. But his archive has proved an incredibly valuable bit of source of sort of information about balls ever since. Now, the National Museum also holds the catalogue of Dorothy Marshall, who was an incredible researcher of Cardstone balls between the 1960s and 1980s. And she basically saw almost every Calvestone ball that was known in Scotland and documented it in this card index. And again, all of her correspondence in the card index sits in the museum. These are a couple of examples of the cards. You can see here it records all the information about the find spots. There's often illustrations of the objects on there, little gems of information about how the object was found. And so this has sort of proved a really invaluable sort of record. Lots of additional bits of information that you just pick up extra gems from. Now, and you can see here this sort of cutout photograph here. She also drew heavily on Coles' catalogue and sort of chopped up some of his photographs and put them into her catalogue too. So Dorothy Marshall, really, she published the results of her work. She published 2 articles on it, but her 1976 article is a really comprehensive piece of work. As I said, it reviewed all the dating evidence. It reviewed all the types of Calvestone balls, and she created this very elaborate typology. You can see here there are more than a dozen different categories. It's based on the number of knobs. It's based on the shapes of the knobs. It's based on the size of the balls and how they're decorated. It's quite a complex typology, and it is one of those typologies that is quite challenging to use, because it doesn't necessarily throw up a huge number of patterns when you plot out the different artifact types in terms of their distribution and location. Now, there's been new research trying to categorize Calvestone balls and study going on recently. Chris Stewart Moffat, who recently got his PhD from the University of Aberdeen, has been working very extensively on Calvestone balls for the last decade. And I hope at some point we'll hear the wonderful results of his work being presented and published. But Dorothy Marshall's catalogue, I've put up a sort of variety of the different Calvestone balls here, just to give you an idea of the sheer sort of range of different types and forms, from sort of 4-knobbed examples, various different 6-knobbed examples. You can see some have very prominent discs on the surface, others rather more rounded knobs. They're finished, their surfaces are finished in different ways. Some have these raised triangular interspaces that sort of really stand out, give an entirely different form to those objects. And then we get the huge variety of Calvestone balls that have multiple knobs across the surface. So, you know, again, they go up to hundreds of knobs, but you get no end of range of different shapes of Calvestone, the knobs, decoration, finish. And then we see this one on the very far end here, which is a sort of combination of the two. You can see one side decorated in small knobs, but the rest of it decorated much like a 6-knob Calvestone ball, but slightly different. So not everything is very easily classified by type. And that's the problem with a lot of our typologies. Things don't necessarily fit into easy categories. Now, I mentioned the decoration of Calvestone balls, and this is really, there are some wonderful, highly decorated Calvestone balls. About 50 Calvestone balls out of that 500 are decorated in some way. And this can take the form of being decoration, incised decoration on the surface that actually marks out the knobs rather than actually cutting them into the surface. But actually more frequently what we see is the decoration incised on the knobs of different Calvestone balls, sometimes carved into the interspaces as well. And we see a whole sort of array of different designs. We have individual lines, we have lattice work, we have concentric circles, spirals, little chevrons like these around the edges of these discs, quite a common feature on these balls. Nested triangles, those most commonly sort of in the interspaces, and zigzags, a very rare feature, but you can see some just being carved along the edge of this the disc here. And then wonderful spirals, both usually sort of double spirals, but occasionally you get these sort of put into wider patterns, such that you can see a triple arrangement of spirals here. And quite remarkably, there are a few where the whole Calvestone ball is effectively carved into a spiral. So a wonderful range of designs, and broadly these fit within the sort of passage grave tradition of Neolithic rock art, which is obviously found mostly along the west coast of Britain, down from Orkney, down the west coast and into Ireland. And so the strong connections here into the sort of major passage grooves, tombs you find in Ireland and all the way up to Orkney. I've put up here an image of a lintel from Perrywall on Westray, and there again you can see that use of concentric circles and spirals. So interestingly, we're getting those designs here going right the way across into Aberdeenshire, but on a different form of material culture. We're getting it on Calvestone balls, portable objects, as opposed to being on tombs. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit on Orkney here, because there are 20 Calvestone balls known from Orkney, which appears to be a sort of concentration in the region. I would argue that it's a concentration that's largely created by an excavation bias, because 8 of these are from Skara Brae, 1 from the Nest of Broadca. There's been 1 discovered at Links of Maltland in their excavations quite recently. So I think, like many things, there's so much excavation has happened in Orkney that what we're seeing is a huge number of objects being found in those Neolithic excavations. Were we to excavate similar number of sites in the Hebrides or in Highland, we'd probably find some Calvestone balls there as well. So I think that is a slight bias, but what we do see in Orkney is a very interesting pattern of objects. So the sort of Calvestone balls, the forms of the Calvestone balls in Orkney are quite different. In Aberdeenshire, about half of all Calvestone balls have 6 knobs, and they tend to be symmetrically arranged around the object. In Orkney, there are a couple of examples of that sort of carving. This one here from Skara Brae, but we see a huge variation in the types of forms. There's a lot of examples that have multiple knobs, such as this example here from Skara Brae, and you can see on the surface of that they tend to be sort of pulled out into little pyramids, as opposed to being sort of rounded knobs. So that seems to be quite a distinctive characteristic of these balls in Orkney. It's worth noting even the Nest of Broadca Calvestone ball, it has 6 discs, which is obviously a very regular number, but the arrangement of the knobs is sort of entirely different to what you normally see in Aberdeenshire, in that they're arranged either in pairs of 2s or 2 groups of 3, rather than being symmetrically arranged around the object. So it's similar but different. And also we see something interesting going on with the forms of these objects in Orkney. So across most of Scotland, they're all spherical. But in Orkney, we see objects such as this oval one here, very much like a sort of rugby ball in its shape. It's discovered at the Hall of Rendell. But it was actually, this one was discovered just after the First World War, and when it was found, it was described as a Mills bomb, so a hand grenade, and it does kind of resemble that quite effectively. But we also see at Skara Brae, we see this example on the left here. You can see it's very much the essence of a Calvestone ball, but these prongs at the end extend outwards. It's a different shape. It's moving away from a sphere into a different form. And in Orkney, we do find a whole range of other sculpted stones. This 3-pronged sculpted stone from Skara Brae, one of several from Orkney. And again, it's got this idea of an ornately sculpted stone, but it's going into a different form. So in Orkney, there seems to be a sort of change in the style and a more sort of expanding of the range of forms and the decoration you might do. So it sort of differs in many respects to other parts of Scotland. But, you know, this could be a chronological thing, or it could be a regional sort of variation on the theme. But it's interesting to note that Orkney has these very distinct characteristics. Now, Chris G has been doing some very good archival research as well. As I said, there's loads of information we can glean from the archives. And Chris has tracked down close provenances for 2 Calvestone balls in Orkney. And we don't know actually where either of these Calvestone balls is in real life. One of them on the left, we know it was in the hands of a family, the Farquhar family, from Sweenabow in Orford, and it was last seen in 1909. In fact, the only record of this object is this photograph, which is in the National Museum. So we have a provenance. We know who had it in 1909. What we don't know is where it is now. But you can see it is an absolutely stunning example of a Calvestone ball. It's carved with those pyramidal knobs. It's got these discs around each end. It's a really elaborate, distinctive form. And the second example is was discovered by John Spence as a child, and he didn't realize the significance of this object until much later, actually, when this other object at Skara Brae was found. And he said, I found one of them when I was a child. And he wrote to Graham Callender at the National Museum, drawing a little sketch of what he saw, because it seemed to have this very distinctive pattern of incised lines running along the side of the object, and also
Hugo seems to have frozen, Raggy.
Yes, I was wondering if it was me who was frozen or Hugo, but it seems to be Hugo indeed.
was given to
there you are, Hugo. Your connection went there for a minute, and the last thing we heard was about the lost Cardstone ball.
Oh, okay. Yes,
I just a few sentences. Thank you.
Okay, so did I talk about the Sweenabow Cardstone ball? Yes. Yes. So is this one on the Spence's Calvestone ball? I'll talk a little bit more. Okay, right. Sorry about that. My connection here sometimes drops, or does drop quite frequently, actually. So this second Calvestone ball, again, we don't know where this one is today, but it came to the attention of archaeologists in the 1930s when this example was discovered at Skara Brae. John Spence wrote to the National Museum saying, I found one of those when I was a child. And so we have this letter where he sort of sketches out what he found. But the whereabouts of this object, we don't know, because he gave it to his cousin who died in 1896. His collection, or his possessions, were sold off at auction. So again, we don't know exactly where this particular object has gone. It could be somewhere in Orkney. It may have been kept. It may have been thrown out. But there is a record that it existed, at least. Now, one of my favourite Calvestone balls is actually this one here. It was found at Hillheads in Ola, so just outside Kirkwall, and it was published by James Walls Kirster in 1881. And I think this is a really intriguing Calvestone ball, because if you look at the top surface, you can see it has these sort of small pyramidal knobs. It's as if it's a Calvestone ball that's bound in string or twine. And you can sort of see this very neat sort of tucking at the top here. And then there's this spiral that goes all the way to the bottom, where there's sort of this elaborate pattern of knotwork. So I do wonder here if we actually have a representation of a Calvestone ball as it would have been in the Neolithic, in some sort of binding. And that binding on this example has been represented in stone. It's a sort of really interesting representation. Now, coming up to more recent sort of work, there's been some very interesting work done by Andy Jones and Marta Diaz Gardanimo, and this was published as Making a Mark in 2019, this book looked at grave goods of the late Neolithic across Britain, primarily the sort of most prestigious grave goods. And there's a chapter devoted to Calvestone balls, and it introduces some very interesting ideas. Andy was very much aware of the challenge of trying to look at the typologies of these objects and tries to rethink them as being perhaps, asking whether we should look at them as objects of process, objects that change effectively over time and over their life. And this is really quite an interesting concept. And I've sort of put together here a sort of idea of how this might work in terms of Calvestone balls that have these raised triangular interspaces, with those being removed over time, the ball gradually getting deeper, more prominent bosses. So it's not a static form. If you think today, we think about making an object, we think of it going from being you think of the concept, you make the object to a finished form. But perhaps that wasn't the case in the past. Perhaps these objects constantly changed over their lives and were constantly reworked. You could add designs on the surface, you could erase those designs. they're things that changed as they were used. So this sort of brings in the sort of brings in a thought process as well, that these objects, they're not just, they could have quite long biographies. They could be objects that are reworked over a period of time. That might be within your own lifetime. It might be a period of generations. But it's interesting to explore if these objects were things that had very long biographies and were reused and reworked over periods of time. Now, this sort of brings me to the work we're doing at the museum. What I'm really trying to do at the moment is bring a lot more of the historic records that we have, make them more publicly available by having some of those digitized. So those wonderful historic catalogues, making that information more available. And at the same time, also compiling those lists of Calvestone balls into a comprehensive database of Calvestone balls, so that we actually have more information about those that are out there. And this is proving very interesting, because Dorothy Marshall, she only recorded Calvestone balls on her list when she had seen them and knew where they were. So lots of those which were known in the 19th century that dropped off the radar weren't in her list. So we get a much higher number of Calvestone balls when we start sort of putting in all those historic ones that have now disappeared temporarily, shall we say. One of the other aspects we're trying to work on is documenting our 3D balls, Calvestone balls in 3D. And this really serves two purposes. The first is really to make these objects more publicly available. We share these models on our Sketchfab account as and when we make them. And this has really, introduced a lot more variety. There's now nearly 100 models of Calvestone balls on our Sketchfab account. Even if you go back 5 years, if you looked for Calvestone balls on the internet, you tended to get the images of the same few Calvestone balls, which gave an impression of certain characteristics of these objects. But actually, when we sort of put out more of these models, you realize this huge variety of the different forms and shapes and decorations of these objects. And the third, or the final part of what I'm trying to do at the moment, is to look at the way in which these objects were made and reworked over time, to try and understand the processes of manufacture, and looking at that through both the 3D models, which show those patterns of manufacture, those sequences of manufacture, and this hopefully will give us a better understanding of the length of use of these objects and how they changed over time. Now, just to give you one quick example, I want to talk about the Sheriff Muir Calvestone ball, which is one that was only recently discovered. It went through Treasure Trove in 2018. Like all archaeological objects in Scotland, it should be reported to Treasure Trove, and this one was allocated to Perth Museum. But when it was coming through the scheme, I had an opportunity to research it and investigate this object. And as part of this, I made a 3D model, and I looked at this object in great detail under a microscope. And this was to try and understand the precise modes of manufacture that this went through. So what we see in this object is we're seeing that they started with, obviously, as they all do, with being pecked to a sphere. And we have slight traces of that pecking still visible on the surface. But that sphere was very heavily ground then into a sort of ground perfect sphere before we see the pecking of the actual discs on the surface. And these we can see from this 3D model, you see this rough area of pecking between each of these. At one point, this Calvestone ball had those raised triangular interspaces we see on other objects. And what we can see on the 3D model is that actually the whole surface of this ball had been very regularly ground to shape. And then at a later date, those triangular interspaces were pecked away with a hammerstone. So that suggests, again, they were removed after a period of time. When we look at the decoration of the surface of this ball as well, there's two panels which have incised decoration. Now this is done with a flint. A flint cuts very effectively the lines on the surface of stone. On this lattice work, it's very clear that they were using probably a piece of leather or something to guide the flint. Each cut is very smooth and clean. There's no evidence of setting out. The lines are incised very cleanly and then made deeper. And we can see under the microscope that they incised all the lines in one direction before turning it around and carving all the lines in the other direction. Now, if you look at the lines on the second disc, you can see they're deeper. They're also more, they're slightly less regular. And actually, under the microscope, you could see that an entirely different technique of incising that line had been used. They've been set out freehand. And what you see is lots of very small lines going across the surface before they eventually get a deeper line and incise that into this deeper groove. So you've got two entirely different modes of cutting those lines. So that does potentially suggest they were done at different dates. And, you know, arguably, the fact it was done in such a different style, could it be different people incising these lines? So again, you can think of that in terms of sort of sequences and potentially biographies of manufacture here. Now, in terms of sort of changing the designs on Calvestone balls, some of those designs look, you know, you could obviously make those designs just deeper and deeper and deeper. But on some Calvestone balls, we see sort of more dramatic transformations. On this example on the left, it has 24 knobs, but if you look carefully, they're arranged in groups of 4. And if you put those sort of discs around it, what you realize is that this is effectively a 6-knob Calvestone ball, that each of the individual discs has been carved up and recarved as 4 small knobs on the surface. So you've seen a 6-knob Calvestone ball turned into a ball with multiple knobs. On these two Calvestone balls here, you can see that happening in a more dramatic style. You can see this big disc here. You can see that it started to be reworked along this edge into smaller knobs, and this surface in the middle here as well being reworked into smaller knobs. So that original design is being transformed from one pattern into something that's entirely different. And there are examples where we have just traces of what was an earlier design. This long sinuous curve running through this lower Calvestone ball here marks out an earlier design on this ball, but that has been entirely pecked away as this has been transformed into hundreds of small little knobs on the surface. So a massive transformation in the form of that object. And we have other examples such as this one on the right hand side, where we see a far more dramatic transformation again, where you can see it's 2 views of the same object. From one side, you can see a sort of classic 6-knobbed Calvestone ball, but when you turn it over, there is a rosette of smaller knobs where one of those larger knobs should be, and the interspaces are marked out again with rounded knobs. Now, this one's an interesting one because you can argue it 2 ways. It almost appears that partway through creating the design of this object, they changed their mind and started following a different design and creating these smaller knobs. So it might be that the whole thing just changed in that process of manufacture and went off in a sort of free-form style. But that's kind of, this process of change seems to make the process of classifying these objects into neat categories really difficult. So there's something interesting going on with the way these seem to be constantly reworked and modified, or certainly in some cases reworked and modified. So we come to the question of function. And everyone always wants to know what these were used for. And what we often see is the suggestion that these are sort of enigmatic objects, mysterious objects. Now, this is really quite frustrating because we have so many suggestions of what these objects were used for. We're really not short of suggestions. In fact, we have a lot of very good possible uses for these objects. Now, from this list, you can see some which are less probable interpretations than others. Suggestions that say these were sort of tradesmen's sort of apprentice pieces. That idea doesn't really work because it's putting a modern view of society where you have tradesmen and apprentices into the Neolithic where you didn't have such roles. But other suggestions could be very plausible. Lynn Kelly, in her book The Memory Code back in 2016, I think, suggested that they could be sort of memory devices, devices that were used to sort of, as you rotated the ball in your hand, you could tell the oral history of your society. And she drew on a lot of parallels of objects found in Aboriginal cultures, also in South Africa, to put forward that view. It's very plausible. So there are lots of good options. I want to sort of focus on a couple of options here because weapons has long been put forward as a possible interpretation. We see Sir John Evans was very keen on them being used as bolas, and I've put an example of a South American bolas here, where you have 3 weights effectively on the ends of twine that were sort of swung and thrown to take down your prey or take down you know, animals or people. But these, you know, this suggestion, it works quite well. You could bind twine around the knobs of these Calvestone balls, but you can always, with interpretations of these objects, put barriers to that interpretation. Many Calvestone balls have quite highly decorated interspaces. That would be covered by the binding, and we don't see where on those areas. There are also, you know, you can see here that you require multiple balls for this particular use. So you have a real issue that most of our Calvestone balls seem to be individual objects. There are a few that seem to have been found together, but not many. And then we have the suggestion that they were mounted as mace heads. And this sort of goes right back to Smith's work in 1874. And he actually drew on an image in the Bayer tapestry to illustrate his point, because he believed these were brought to Scotland by fleeing Saxons, a theory that didn't catch on very well. But you can see here, we obviously know this is not a representation of a stone ball today, but this was his idea. But the idea that these could somehow be bound to a stick and used as a mace head has sort of lingered in archaeological references. But, you know, it's a possibility. When we look at, say, examples like the Towie ball here, we have 3 very highly decorated discs, but the one on the bottom here, the one you never usually see, doesn't have any decoration at all. So the suggestion would be here that that was somehow bound to a staff with, again, twine going around that surface to bind it. So it's an option. I mean, and certainly what we do see in the late Neolithic is a lot of evidence for violence. And this really, you know, it comes back with how we think about the late Neolithic. You know, whether it was communities all getting on well together, or whether we think of this as a rather more unpleasant situation with elites competing to build the biggest tombs, the biggest stone circles, and motivating people to do that, potentially with
Oh no, he's frozen again. There you
hello,
are.
am I back again?
You're back again.
Did I disappear again?
The last words we heard were potentially with.
Potentially with. So did I mention? Well, so yes. Anyway, with the late Neolithic, Orkney may well not have been it may have been a place where we're seeing sort of elites playing out their power through the construction of these big monuments, big tombs, big stone circles, and there's certainly, you know, this influence of power could have been backed up by violence. Certainly, when we see the other prestigious objects of the time, we're looking at these mace heads here, which there again in Orkney there's a very big number of these, more than 100 mace heads from Orkney, and in Aberdeenshire we find these again, but in lower numbers. But these objects, they're, you know, we find traces of blunt force trauma on some individuals in the Neolithic, and there's one example which Angela Boyle and colleagues have pointed out recently from Queen Tomb, where the top of this skull here, you can see that large hole is created by a blunt weapon. Now that could be a mace head, it could be a carved stone ball, but these objects may well have sort of served a similar purpose. We also have in Orkney quite a lot of the cattle, which we can see certainly from Skara Brae and other sites have been poleaxed as well. So that's sort of striking directly on the head with a weapon. And we have a really interesting, you know, we have an interesting question about what object they were using for that purpose. But as you know, in the late Neolithic, your wealth was going to predominantly be through cattle, through the animals you had. The killing of an animal would have been a very important event. And it would be hardly unsurprising that you had a very important object, a very significant tool to use for that purpose. Now, one of the other common interpretations of these is objects of power and status. Now, this does not necessarily, this can be combined with so many of the other interpretations that have been put forward for these objects. We have just 3 examples of carved stone balls here, but you can see they're amongst some of the most highly decorated, some of the finest artifacts we find in Neolithic Scotland. The skills and the execution of the carving of these objects is incredibly fine and quite remarkable, and they sort of sit up there in terms of the portable artifacts. Carved stone balls and mace heads are amongst the finest artifacts we get. Now, certainly these could be seen as status items in that respect, but this doesn't preclude other interpretations. If we think of the chronology of these objects, they may have been used over several centuries, or certainly generations. And what we see is potentially a change in use over this time. If you think, you know, we can think to say our own Houses of Parliament having a mace head, a ceremonial mace head in use. It's obviously referencing medieval weapons. We could see over time a similar change in the objects, and that could be a physical change in the use of all these objects, or we could see that some of these objects take on importance over time, and they might start off as relatively plain objects, becoming more and more highly decorated and elaborately carved in certain situations. But what's clear is that they were very important to communities and individuals, and I think the more we can look at those finer biographies of how they were manufactured, reworked, how designs on them changed, we might better understand how they developed over their lifetime and were potentially used. So I'm not going to give an answer as to what I think these are used for, because I think there are an awful lot of options and a lot of good options for these objects. They are good objects to think with. The fact that people can really engage with them and have suggestions about their different uses is fantastic. It's obviously very easy to try and force a single interpretation on these objects, but I think, you know, they are open to a lot of different interpretations, both practical and more sort of symbolic. So I will leave it there and just sort of flag that we have some 3D models available online. The National Museum Scotland account has all of the National Museum's 3D models. I have a lot of the other 3D models from different museums hosted on my personal Sketchfab account, but there's a lot of 3D content you can look at. And, you know, do come back to me with suggestions. And if you know where any of the missing Cardstone balls are, do let me know. I'd be very intrigued. I know where these ones are in Edinburgh that are on the screen, but they're very much more a modern object. Obviously, the inspiration and the fact that these objects do still have such a strong resonance today, and I think that's a really important thing for these particular things. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
I'll just give you some applause on behalf of everybody here. Jane, did you want to share the questions?
Yes, I can do that. There are some questions which you have already answered. But the one that came through first, which I don't think you have discussed, is how heavy are the balls?
Well, it's a good point, actually. They're mostly between sort of 400 or 500 grams and sort of 700 grams. Basically, they're made of lots of different rocks, so it depends what rock you made them from. So some from sandstone are very light, those from igneous rocks are much heavier. But that's where the idea that their weight really goes to pot, because although they're a similar size, they all weigh a huge amount of different, weigh a different different amounts depending on the ground, specific density of the rock.
Thank you. Another question is about the projections, the points on them. The one on the Skara Brae example, 3-pointed object from Coines and the pointed one from Poole. Have you any thoughts on those projecting points on some of them?
Well, again, we don't have much use where they've not been and I mean the thing is with Cardstone balls as well, no one's really done detailed use wear on these to try and understand some of the patterns of damage on the surface. But the pointed objects from Orkney, they don't really show much damage on those points, not that we can interpret in a specific way. They sort of almost have grooves on the back. They're clearly sort of meant to be handled, some of those, or held, those objects. And again, it comes back to, they do look rather like weapons when you put them in that circumstance. They're certainly they're very striking objects in that respect.
And from the same person, a comment about the pellet decoration and how similar it is to some pottery decoration. And I think there are some other examples of similarities between.
Yeah, certainly. Again, some of the designs go into grooveware pottery. Sorry, I'm back again. I think I went off for a second. But yes, there are parallels with other aspects of ceramics in particular. Some of those designs go quite strongly across.
Some mention of whether they're to do with fibers or loom weight, possible suggestions of uses.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
There are some questions about fibers, whether they were used for weighting fibers or winding fibers.
I think I only caught the end of that question about winding fibers around them. Yeah, I mean, there have been all sorts of suggestions about how they could be used in rope work or for knot work. Again,
And you're back, Hugo. Hugo, I think it's better if you mute yourself while Jane is asking the question, because otherwise we get an echo.
Okay, and I think I'll just ask one last one. There's obviously lots of excitement and lots of comments on some of the more bloodthirsty potential purposes, and somebody asking if there's any residue analysis that can be done to look for traces of such.
I think there is. The problem again comes back to how few we have from good archaeological contexts. That many that we have in our collections had been in circulation for 100 or more years before they eventually came to a museum. Some of them we have very long accounts of how many years they're in use. Many of them are covered in very greasy black handling sort of stains. So we'd get a lot of residues from what they've been doing for the last 150 years and a lot of use wear on them. So what we really need is more well excavated examples that we can actually look for those fresh patterns of use damage and use wear. Yeah, I think there's a real challenge in looking at the old ones from that respect, because you might find how they were used in the last 100 years as opposed to 4,000 years ago.
Just going to let one last question sneak in. Were they made from water-worn beach or river pebbles, or were they quarried stone? Do you know?
It's a good question. We don't really know. There's a very big variety. So what we do know is that there isn't really a specific quarry that Calvestone balls were coming from. They're made from a very wide variety of rocks. The easiest way to make them is obviously having a ball that is vaguely of the right shape, but you know, unless you're on very specific storm beaches, you're not going to get very spherical stones. So you are going to have to do quite a lot of pick dressing to get a sphere. And actually most of your time in making a Calvestone ball is actually in making the sphere of stone, in terms of just pick dressing it into that shape, is going to be the most time consuming bit of that process. So I would suspect they're working from cobbles of some kind, but we don't really have those traces, because obviously at an early stage it's not necessarily going to look much like a Calvestone ball. We do have lots of spears of stone which are often not included in the totals with Calvestone ball, but they're probably on their way to becoming a Calvestone ball. But we rarely have any trace of the original surface to see if it was a beach cobble or a river cobble.
Thank you, Hugo. I think I'll hand over to Colin to close up now, but that excited a lot of great questions, and everyone's really enjoyed the talk. There's much praise. So I'll hand over to Colin to close the session.
Well, thank you, Jane, and thank you, Hugo, for an excellent talk. The thing about these Calvestone balls is the fact that we really don't know what they are. And one of the things that I think Andy Jones has really brought out is that, and of course, and particularly some of the work you've been doing on looking at just the way they're made and the way you see these differences and so on. I mean, his argument is they're all about effect, you know, effect with an A. And I can't help thinking with some of those, you know, it brings to mind some of Alfred Gell's work on enchantment. They really are enchanting to hold and to look at. So maybe that's the best way. Maybe that's the best way to think about them, and just the sort of fascination of the thing in itself. Because they're like an eternal mystery, aren't they? And the sort of history that you charted just literally illustrates that mystery. So thank you very much, Hugo. It's great to see you, apart from anything. And thank you very much for giving an excellent seminar.